Hey everybody, back to exploring the fascinating history of Northern Africa, going into Andalusia, specifically. In this particular podcast, we're going to talk about the development of certain weapons and what are some of the weapon classes that many of these raiding parties had. So, just as a quick reminder, we ended our last podcast with the story of the Black Knight, the idea that the knights had to be proficient in multiple weapons. So, Adam, Frank, welcome aboard, and maybe just a quick 1 minute recap of the idea of the knights and the weapons they carried, and then let's jump into what some of these weapons were. Over to you, buddy.
All right, so we're talking about the fetis. Fetis coming from, I believe, and Frank, you can confirm this. It's a loan word from Farsi that refers to somebody who is sort of a horseman, and that's sort of like the same idea as a caballero in Spanish or a chevalier in French. It's a horse-born warrior.
It
Um,
essentially sorry.
no, please
Saying
continue.
it'll essentially translate to like of the horse for all intents. So like if you were let's say like I don't know, if you were perhaps a knight of some sort or upper class warrior who was mounted, your name throw out a good Arab name. I don't know.
Khalid bin Walid.
Yeah, so Khalid, let's just say Khalid Al Faris. So Khalid Al Horse, for example, right? That essentially dictate the title that you are of noble status enough to fight on horseback.
Right. And so you have sort of like these warriors who are of that certain class, and they would train to fight with all different kinds of weapons. If you look in the different manuals like Kitab al-Mashum or Mihyat al-Sul, you'll see everything ranging from wrestling to knife fighting, stick fighting. Uh, just they need to be able to basically fight with everything. They need to be an ultimate warrior. And then later on, you end up having this movement from this noble class to what would be the equivalent of, I keep using the samurai example, but it's sort of the best equivalent that I can explain because a slave soldier like a Mamluk would have status, would have land, would, may or may not be married, but they were slaves to the Sultan. And so they were basically a bound warrior whose entire life were revolved around learning how to fight with various weapons. And so they would have to be proficient with all of these different things. So if they needed archers, they needed to be able to become an archer. If they needed somebody who would, fully armor up and fight close on foot on the battlefield, they prepared them for that. If they needed to be able to come in as a cavalry with a lance, they needed to be able to do that. So they had to be a jack of all trades and be dangerous with literally any weapon that they picked up. That sort of filters down to now the common soldier, in that the common soldier would get a watered down version of whatever the Faris or the Mamluk would be trained in. And a lot of these things also now are heavily influenced by Central Asian Turks, in that a lot of the tools for fighting in that way was a bit more advanced. I really don't like using the word more advanced, but you often see similarities in the way that Central Asian Turks will fight and how Mamluks will fight, largely because many of them were brought in from the Caucasus and those traditions were carried forward. But being able to fight with a curved sword and a shield with a bow on your back, and being able to convert to one or the other very quickly, all sort of flows into that tradition. And so, as sort of a member of sort of the lower infantry, a lot of those techniques will now sort of infiltrate because you're trying to emulate the, you know, the I guess their version of the NBA players. You're trying to play and fight like that, if that makes any sense. But Frank, I'll pass it on to you if you have any input.
Yeah. In the earlier days, like are we talking about a little bit later on? Or are we talking like the earlier days right now, or just generally speaking?
Just generally speaking, going from the earlier days, the conversion from the knighted,
All right.
the high class knights to the slave soldiers, sort of how they moved from one to the other.
All right, cool. Because I want to make sure I was going to be putting the right information. Yeah. So with all that in mind, you've got that about like the more elite, but I also want to touch a little bit on what the arms and armor were looking like of the peoples that were brought into the empire as they went. Speaking of someone who has a lot of Amazigh ancestry, I kind of wanted to touch on just a little bit on what your indigenous peoples of North Africa, especially like concerning like Morocco, right? Because that's where they were going to gather a bulk of their forces from. We're going to be in like that northern Morocco area. This is when it starts to get really interesting. You have to remember, because a lot of these are nomadic peoples, they're not relying as heavily on the heavier armament that you would expect to have come from settled city centers, right? If you have more of the upper echelon of warrior class bringing like their mail with them, right, in the earlier periods, right? There's a little bit, not a ton of evidence of like scale armor and early lamellar being used in that area, mostly imported. They weren't developing lamellar by themselves in this place, but in North Africa. But what you're looking at the indigenous peoples using here, lots and lots of gambesons. I mean, lots of gambesons. Male was a rarity, usually pretty much only reserved for your leaders of these clans and tribes, or maybe you achieved it in some kind of really, really good lucrative trade deal. Maybe your new Arab overlords awarded it to you for your good service. But huge weapons of different Amazigh tribes. Mainly speaking, you're gonna have a lot of spears and a lot of shields paired with gambesons, simple helms, and a lot of the times their tagelmusts or their turbans were bulky enough and tied in such a way that would actually provide you some kind of decent head protection as well. But I think that the gambesons are a really good point to note on this, that a lot of people are like, oh, well, like, how are they protective? How do they actually serve any purpose? Well, there were several hundred years where that was the main armament of peoples in that region. So again, with the Amazigh and the local indigenous populations, you're looking at very light armor with like mail or scale being reserved for your generals or officers of your army.
And let's also not forget that leathers were also fairly common.
Yeah.
Even just like, because when we talk about lamellar, a lot of people tend to think of the little metal scales, but there's also the leather scales that people would wear, or bands of leather. There was a really interesting find. I think we talked about this before, from Syria, where they were showing bands of leather that would have covered the arms. So leather was also something that would have been worn. And while people often talk about, and I have to get into the leather armor controversy, people talk about how leather armor wasn't necessarily something that people wore. And the only reason we really think that is because leather armor doesn't preserve very well. It is an organic material, so it's not going to last 600-700 years like well-preserved mail might, or it's not going to last 1,000 years like well-preserved plate might. So if you do find bits and pieces of leather armor, because even sometimes you find, I'll give a good example. There's a cuirass from, I want to say the Kanem-Bornu Empire. It was made of iron, and you could tell that it had a leather lining on the inside because it had all of the loops for the leather pieces, but the leather had all rotted out. So you only have the metal that's left over. And so if you consider that, you're not really going to have a lot of that evidence. And then later on, and Frank, you can confirm if this was due to Ottoman influence. You had a type of armor that had fabric on one side, chain in the middle, and then fabric on the outside. And that was also something that was used by Frank. Can you confirm? Was this Janissaries, or was this generally something that was adopted later on?
So that's actually a Kazagand, and a Kazagand is actually a Persian invention. And Kazagans, adopted by the Turks. So basically, you would have like a gambeson like mine, a kaftan, so to speak. I brought this just because good visual comparison. It's thick padding. But in between the layers, like you said, there would be chain. And that eventually would make its way, into this area of the world. So yeah, it's called the Kazagan, and I'm really glad you brought that up because I almost completely forgot about Kazagans. They were super important, and that's why in miniatures you very rarely see, by the way, it looking like people from Middle East and North Africa were wearing chain. They were wearing it. It was literally just in between the layers of the fabric. So it's one of those kind of like Eurocentric ideas. They weren't wearing chain under their armor. That was a European thing. Not true. You just couldn't see it.
And that's largely a function of the environment they were fighting in, because you don't want to be wearing lots of exposed metal in the heat of the North African sun or even the heat of southern Spain. It doesn't go very well.
No.
You see practices in parts of Africa where they will have the sort of the steel breastplate, but then they'll wear the gambeson on top of it, and that's to keep it from cooking you in your kit. So armor like the Kazagan will give you the protection of a chain, but at the same time, you won't have to worry about this chain getting super hot while you are out sort of doing the thing. And I think during
You're not getting
that was
cooked,
one of the
basically.
Yes, you're not getting cooked, exactly. And I think this was kind of an issue at the Battle of Hattin, where the Crusaders were marching in their armor in the Middle Eastern desert sun, and many of them ended up just dropping from heat exhaustion because their metal armor was exposed to the sun, and they were cooking in it. It was fairly merciless. Meanwhile, you have the Saladin's forces, many of whom came from Egypt, who were wearing kazagans or were wearing their chain underneath fabric, or they were just wearing leathers, and they were a bit better able to cope with the merciless desert sun. And so this was something that was also carried. That concept is also carried by the Amazigh and the Arabs and some of their West African conscripts, because that's another thing we have to talk about. The West African conscripts, like the black, what were they called? The Black Guard. That's it, Prince Ismail's Black Guard, and they were all they brought these approaches with them into Spain. And even some of the ways that they fought on horseback were actually adopted by the Spaniards. There's this really interesting style of writing called writing a la jinete, and that's sort of the idea that you have. It's named after the Saneta tribe, who are from North Africa, and it's the idea of having a high front and a high back on your saddle, and the stirrups are actually short, so you're riding with your legs bent. And that is because it provides a more solid platform for you to be able to do maneuvers on your horse, with your bow, or with your lance. And it's still done today by bull riders. And the reason that this was preferred, as opposed to having the legs long in the saddle, the longer stirrups, is because it allowed you to be able to manipulate movement on the back of the horse a lot faster, and you can be a bit more maneuverable by making yourself a smaller package and reducing and lowering your center of gravity, or keeping your center of gravity closer to the horse. So as the horse moves, you're able to move with it a little bit better when the horse is rapidly changing directions. So those are sort of some of the things that were adopted into Spain and were ended up carried on later. Another item that was adopted by the Spanish from the North Africans was the adarga shield. The adarga, or the aldarca. Oh, Frank, you want to say something?
No, I have a really good example of one pulled up for when you're ready. Just let me know.
Okay, so the adarga. So the adarga or the aldarca is actually a kind of heart-shaped shield that was originally designed in Fez, Morocco, I believe. It was very popular among the Amazigh. You actually see it a lot in depictions of battles in Iberia. And it was made of ibex hide, and was often very ornate. Now, here's the interesting part. After the conquest of Granada, the adarga was carried by Spanish conquistadors into the Americas. They actually preferred that to the metal shields because it was still very, very strong in terms of being able to protect them against projectiles and other weapons, but it was also very light because it was made of ibex hide. So it was this nice blend of the sort of the two approaches. And you actually see an example of an adarga in Mexico from the 19th century that was still used centuries later. you see images of the conquistadors arriving in Mexico and the Caribbean carrying adargas with them, which also goes to another point about a lot of the people that they ended up sending to the Americas were descendants of or recently converted people who were maybe previously Muslims and then became Christians, and then were sort of shipped out on a boat by Ferdinand and Isabella into the Americas. Um, and then this also goes back to many. This is why you find a lot of people in the Americas, especially in former Spanish colonies, who end up having North African ancestry, because that would have come through the Spanish and Portuguese, who would have sort of gotten that ancestry in Iberia during the Andalusian period. But that's another conversation. But Frank, you had that. Show the adarga. Show the adarga.
So one thing, I do have it from a 14th century wall painting from the Alhambra here on in this book. So these shields had a very, very long use. Not only where they were starting their usage before the Islamic conquest of Spain, but you can see it right here in as late as the 14th century. Oh God, that's really terrible. But yeah, you can see it roughly painted out right here. And then if you want to see an actual example, this is from a museum in Vienna that I have one ready to go. You can see it right there. This is a very, very elaborate later period example. But this is roughly like what they're looking like. Some of them had forearm straps. Some of them had dual handles in the center. They were kind of really modifiable for a warrior's preference, right? That's the advantage of them being made out of some kind of material like hide, right? You have an advantage to kind of modify them the way that you would see fit to. And there's a bunch of other really good examples that still survive. Fortunately, because of the heat of the region, you do have leather goods surviving quite well. So we're very fortunate that the climate of the area allows us to have these things so well preserved.
And that dual handle structure is actually fairly common in a lot of the shields that you see in the Islamic world. So here's an example of sort of generic sort of North African steel shield that would have been used. And you'll see here, so this is a strap for carrying it on the back, but here you'll see the exact same thing. You'll see the two straps in the center, and that is for either holding it in this fashion or holding it in this fashion. And all of that is dependent on the needs of the warrior. So if I, for example, want to be able to shoot a bow while holding my shield, then what I will do is I will adjust the straps and I will move my hand up. And now I can hold the shield on my arm while I shoot a bow. If I need to be able to hold a knife, I will hold the straps in the center, and then I will take my knife, usually with something larger, and I will hold it like that. So if this is a smaller shield or a larger knife, you'd end up having the knife protrude from the bottom in this way. And I think the Persians do something very similar.
Yes, we do.
There you go. So that's there's also some images of Mamluks going through exercises where they're holding an extra sword in their shield hand and sort of prepared to pull that out when they are engaging with their opponents. So that single strap and double strap has a lot of allows for a lot more versatility, as opposed to what you tend to see with a lot of European bucklers, where it's just one handle in the center here. So it's just sort of a whittled down shield boss, if you will, as opposed to having these different grips that you can apply, or even to hang it over your neck or over your back while you are taking it into battle.
So what are some of the other weapons and weapon classes that were used by these raiding parties as they moved up?
So javelins were a really big thing. both from a mounted and infantry perspective, right? We tend to classify sometimes a spear as a spear, but it's very important, especially with these conquests and the context of Middle East, North Africa, to really separate between a javelin and a spear. Like, you don't throw a spear. I mean, you can. I've seen you do it. I was on the receiving end of it a couple times. Adam, wink, wink. So yeah, so like you can, but there were very clear distinctions between a spear and a javelin, and both forces were using them on mounted and on foot. What you're also having a lot is, believe it or not, crossbows. You're seeing early crossbows come in as influence from the Visigoths in Spain, coming back down to the conquering armies. There are several plates in Egypt as well as in Morocco and Spain that show mounted crossbowmen using them off horseback as well. So you had a lot of different various projectiles. There's actually not a ton of pictorial evidence of horseback archery. There's some, right? Like we talked about having conscripted peoples from Central Asia and stuff, but as they start to settle into Spain, the idea of mounted archery kind of tends to diminish a little bit. Whether that's because of the fact that it fell out of favor, people became more heavily armored, warfare changed, I couldn't tell you right now, but the idea of bow use kind of started to slowly phase out. But there's a lot of variation in projectiles.
Well, there's also arquebusiers in the 15th century. So in the early to mid 15th century, arquebusiers started to become very popular. They would purchase gunpowder firearms from Europe, and then those would end up being used in, for example, some of the wars between Morocco and the Songhai, and Morocco and Mali. They would use arquebuses, and then they actually started producing their own firearms, the name of which is escaping me right now. Frank, do you remember the name of the North African musket? It's escaping me. They use it for the Fantasia rideouts.
I want to make sure I am pronouncing it correctly. I don't want to embarrass my own people. 1 second.
This was that, and the blunderbuss was also something that was adopted in the 16th century, or the 17th century. They also started to adopt sort of the pistols that were being used by Europeans at the same time as well. Those would end up getting paired with sabers, especially with influence from the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans were a gunpowder kingdom. When North Africa became absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, the use of gunpowder weapons essentially exploded. And so, in Europe, you sort of have this very famous sort of sword and pistol approach to combat. It was the same thing in North Africa. So you would have a weapon like a nimcha, so I have here, and a nimcha, you'd have this in one hand, and then you'd have a pistol in the other. So you'd get on the ship, pow pow with your pistol, maybe you've got 2 or 3 of them, and then you go in and start going to work with the nimcha and really getting into close quarters. This is sort of like the North African equivalent of the cutlass. Then, of course, they did come in varying sizes, varying degrees of straightness. You have straighter ninjas, you have more curved ninjas, depending on the taste of the person who has purchased that sword. But those also sort of became a thing later on, especially as they were clashing with people like, what is his name? Like Henry the Navigator, when he invaded North Africa, and they had that whole unfortunate situation that caused a succession crisis in Portugal. And then, of course, knives. Knives were a thing. The knives that they would use in the Maghreb would be more like humia daggers, which are similar to khanjars, but they would have more of a curve, they wouldn't have the nice little animal motif on the top. It would be more curved, sort of like this round top here that would sort of keep your hand in place. This tended to be a bit thinner and a lot more curved. It was really a sort of a devastating weapon for stabbing. The curves were great in that you could sort of get into those really awkward angles if you needed to get into somebody's, if somebody was wearing plate or chain and you want to get around the neck or get under here, you'd be able to do that. And an interesting note, The Jumia was actually used all the way up into the Rif War in the 1920s. So the Spanish were fighting against people using Jumias all the way from the Middle Ages into the 1920s. So that's sort of a little interesting tidbit.
Yeah, it's called a rifle is called one word for it is Mukala. The French
Yes.
the French tended to mispronounce it. Sometimes you hear the term Milike used oftentimes in firearms from Morocco and Tunisia. The Milike rifle you would hear called that a lot too. But I want to piggyback something on you're mentioning about the Nimsha and the variety of weapons. The curvature reminded me, right? Much like most places in the Middle East, North Africa, you don't see a complete abandonment of straight swords either. Right? Like a lot of people believe that suddenly straight swords stopped being used in the Islamicate world and they were just abandoned in favor of curved weapons. Not true, especially not true in the Maghreb and the Middle East and so the Maghreb and North Africa, right? Because not only do you have by the 15th century, you see early versions, maybe not like a proto Nimcha showing up, right? They're looking more like a developed saber with cross guards coming in. But then you also have what's called it's a problematic term, but the classical Moorish sword that you see popping in that has the very, very elongated downward facing keons. But then you also have, like, for example, this is a replica I have of a Nasrid sword that they found. I use it for Buhurt when I need a straight sword that looks way more traditionally like a European, like a European arming sword. So you have a simultaneous usage of curved weapons that can be really good for horseback combat and obviously on foot, and then straight swords that might be something that people who are more accustomed to fighting on foot would be using that are very good and effective at the thrust as well as the cut. So you didn't just have one style being abandoned for the other. These were they're multi-class armies that could benefit from the use of either style.
And I think it's also important to note about the context in which the weapons were used, right? Like if you think about the sort of Boabdil, I think it's King Muhammad the 11th, but in any way, he had that Moorish sword also known as a jineta.
Thank you.
And yes, and the jineta was fairly common among the Moors, especially because, and we also have to remember that they were fighting the Spanish, who had a more European style of armor. And some people may hate me for saying this, but a curved sword that is cut centric is not going to do a lot of damage against somebody who's wearing, say, 15th century plate. You might be able to do some concussive, but you're not cutting through the armor. If you can find a way to cut into areas that are not armored, or you manage to be able to score thrust at a particular angle, phenomenal. But weapons like these are largely designed for fighting people who are lightly armored or not really armored at all. And Frank, you can agree or disagree. And but weapons like the Hineta with a more advanced point will allow you to get thrust into gaps in somebody's armor, and that more closely mirrored sort of the way that their European, well, I guess they were arguably Europeans, but their Christian counterparts that lived north of them would fight. You even see people adopting some bits of European armor, like Boabdil himself had a salet that he wore for jousting. Frank, you wanted to chime in?
No, you're reading my mind, man. So first off, yeah, you can thrust the gaps with a curved sword. You just got to practice a lot for it. I mean, it was a lot easier to throw someone a straight sword and be like, stab at the exposed bits. But I do have a Saleh here from the Met. There's a little bit of controversy around this helmet. I'm just going to put it right now because somewhere there's some armchair historians who are going to freak out when I share this. But basically, like, it had a lot of retouch work done to it by by some armorers in later centuries, but a lot of it is still original. And there's some debate whether you actually want to classify it as Nasrid or not. In my opinion, the helmet itself was dated to the Nasrid period. Whether or not the additions came later, it doesn't matter. The helmet was dated to this period. But it shows the blending of cultures well, either way you want to look at it. But right here, this is Saleh from the Met. It's one of the last known surviving Nasrid pieces of armor. There's not many left around. And you can see right here, you know, that is a traditional Spanish style Saleh, but it has been adorned with Islamic style geometric designs, and you've got gold ornamentation, and in certain area, I mean, it's beautiful, and you can see the calligraphy that runs along the bottom here. Now, what's really interesting too is that you got to remember there were Christians in Andalusia who wrote in Arabic, right? So you had copies of the Bible that were in Arabic. So it actually wasn't that uncommon to see armament used from Spanish knights that would be Spanish Christian knights that were adorned with Arabic calligraphy, because you were combining the idea of prayer and protection, except this time it's not through Christian powers. So this piece right here is a really, really cool example of how these cultures blended. It's an amazing piece. If you get a chance to go to the Met and look at it, you just stare at it for like an hour because of how intricate everything is. And I think this would actually be the exact helmet you were talking about, right, Adam?
Not this exact helmet, but it has a very similar look. Bawab has more of a sort of sweep in the back down the neck. It looks more like it looks a bit more like an Italian salad. But this is fairly typical in terms of the shape for the type of helmet that the Moors would have been wearing in that period.
Yeah, I mean, according to the Met here too, it says it is a Spanish style, but it wouldn't surprise me if maybe like at some point that back piece got swept upwards. You know, cultures blend. But I figured it'd just be a good example to show physically how these cultures came together.
Absolutely, and I think that's sort of the other piece. It's almost like when you watch the different cultures blend together with the way that they approach warfare and the way that they adopt weapons. It's when you fight another person enough, you start to adapt some of their ways that you find are working for you. So the same way the Spanish adopted, you know, adargas and riding a la jinete and different swords, you'll see the Moors do the same thing with adopting different types of armor and adapting their swords to fight in a more European context.
Yeah, see, this is a very critical point that, you know, a lot of the nationalists don't want to ever pay attention to, that your enemy shapes you, man. And the more you fight somebody, the more you become like them, because, you know, those are the strategies, those are the weapons that you're fighting, and you adapt. And the more you begin to adapt to a certain weapon, guess what? It changes how you move. And this is a critical piece, and this is one of the key threads that we are looking to do with Immersion Labs with this thing, is to say, hey, you know, it's not just one thing. You have to study the relationships to know how each shaped other. And all the genius doesn't belong to one particular ethnic group or one particular region, but it's a culmination of all these forces coming together that rose all the ships, so to speak. Go ahead, Adam. Didn't mean to cut you off, but I think that's a very salient point that people don't pay enough attention to, in my opinion.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I actually have a really interesting story for you. So that is the story of this particular Shamshir design. So this particular Shamshir design is called the Mamluk saber. Frank, we've had this talk about this particular Mamluk design. So this particular design is based on a sword that was carried by Napoleon. Now, Napoleon got this design after fighting in Egypt at the Battle of the Pyramids. He was so impressed with the design of the Mamluk saber and the speed of the weapon that he had one made for him in a style that sort of fit the way he fought. So here you already have an influence of, and sort of this is sort of the way I rationalize it. So this sword became super popular in Europe during the 19th century. You see a lot of portraits of generals and nobles and princes carrying Mamluk sabers. Actually, Emperor Haile Selassie himself had a Mamluk saber that he wore as part of his dress uniform. So that is a Europeanized version of an Africanized version of an Ottoman version of a Persian version of a sword that they had that was somehow brought to them. And even the United States military has a Mamluk saber that they use. I believe it's the Marine Corps has a, I think they spell it Mamaluk saber, based on a Mamluk saber that was gifted to a member of the Marine Corps during the Barbary Wars. And so now you have an American version of an African version of an Ottoman version of a Persian version of another weapon. So it just kind of shows you how all of these different cultures blend together, and you end up seeing these things in all of these different places.
Yeah, makes sense. Any other weapons or that you want to highlight right now before in the forthcoming podcast we'll get into some of the specific things like the nimcha and the staff and spear. Anything else that you want to bring forth today?
I think the only last point I want to make on it is it became very difficult over the course of time to differentiate between the two sides of people that were fighting each other. There are actually accounts of friendly fire, really bad blunders happening because people looked so identical to one another. So it's just important to note that it's reflective of this entire region of the world, that there wasn't really, just like how there's a blurred line between cultural separation that extended into arms and armor as well. I hate to say that if there ever could be a region of the world that was almost amalgamous, it could be here in terms of arms and armor, because it was really hard to separate. So that's just a big overarching theme I think it's important to remember.
Adam, anything on your end?
I think that pretty much covers this section. So I know we're going to get more into sort of the early modern era in the next part. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and folks listening or watching in onto this, Adam, we've invited Adam over to Holy Blood, Holy Blade, and he's specifically going to cover the Nimcha, and we've dedicated one podcast to what it is, how it was made, and how it was used. So stay tuned to that. So with that, again, Adam, Frank, thank you guys. I know it's vacation time and you guys have taken times away from your friends and family to come and nerd out and geek out with me. So I truly appreciate you all for that, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you, gentlemen.
For some, it's the quest of an empire. For some, it's been the quest of power and riches. For some, the quest for honor. And yet for others, the quest for freedom. Blades and bladecraft have done just that. So Richard Burton has said, the history of the sword is the history of mankind. And that's the journey we are on. No blade culture has defined the world as much as the Spanish bladecraft. And yet, no art develops in a vacuum. It is shaped by those that it interacts and fights with, and also shapes the cultures whether they are conquered or manage to maintain their freedom. In this particular lab, we're going to look at how Spanish bladecraft influenced arts across the 5 continents. We've traversed 20,000 plus miles, brought in teachers with over 700 years of combined bladecraft experience, together in one place at one time, where over 3 days and 40 hours of non-stop training, you will be able to see and experience firsthand how it shaped Europe, how it shaped the bladecraft of Northern Africa, how it developed the arts, both indigenous and otherwise, in Philippines. Moving over to Latin America, from the jungles of Colombia and Panama, how the arts of machete developed. Coming further up north, looking at the arts of the southwest Mexicali region, where the long bullwhip was developed. Or looking at the development of a very American form of fighting, the Bowie bladecraft. The impact on the Asian martial arts itself, with the Chinese art being completely transformed by fencing and fencing footwork. Lastly but not the least, is looking at the biomechanics of what full contact bladecraft does, how it shapes your movement and what works and what doesn't work. This is the experiment we are embarking on. The lucky few who come here will get a view of 500 years of bladecraft that developed across 5 continents, and the relationship between the conquerors and the conquered, between the wannabe conquerors and the freedom fighters, between those who fought as pirates and those who fought to maintain their honor. This is that experiment. This is holy blood, holy blade. For more information, look below.